After creating our structure for using the Maven archetype, the first thing we want to do is define project organization. So I've opened up the AEMcast demo project in IntelliJ. You could use it in Eclipse or whatever your favorite Java IDE is. So I'm going to navigate into the content project, and this is going to essentially model CRX. So I'm going to drill into this, down into our apps AEMcast demo folder, and you'll see that the Maven archetype created the config and install folders for us. So the first thing that we're going to want to do is create our application's Global Dot Jsp. And this Global Dot Jsp is something that we will include as part of every JSP in our project. So I've gone ahead and pasted in the global folder, and within this global folder is a global JSP. So let me open this up. All this currently does is include the foundational global JSP that defines all of the variables that are injected into the JSP's page context using CQ-define objects and the related tag libs. So we'll actually want to use our global JSP in our project's JSPs rather than the foundation, just in case we ever need to provide some global functionality. I also like adding this within a global folder in case we want to break out any other global behaviors into supporting scripts. We have a nice place to put those. So after we have this, the next thing we want to do is create our organization for our components. And those will go into our components folder. So I've added this components folder, and it has some base organization that I'll walk you through. So at the first level we have content and page, and this is very standard. The content folder will contain components that are dragged from the sidekick onto the page, or also components that are fixed, included onto our page templates using the CQ include tags. The page folder will contain components that actually implement page definitions. So let's take a quick look in the content folder here. You'll see that I've actually broken this out further into some very general buckets. For your project, you'll want to think about what buckets make sense in terms of the types of components that you'll be creating and the type of app that you're creating. Generally, these seem to fit pretty well, but of course aren't necessarily the best choice for you. So I encourage you to think about what makes sense. Just to give you a brief overview, accounts would hold things like login components, logout, registration. The navigation would hold typical navigation components, breadcrumbs, any sort of footer navigation. Profile would hold things like components for editing profile information or displaying profile icons, typically things to display information about a user or let a user edit information about him or herself. The site components would be things like headers and footers, and then finally we have a general folder which can be used for really anything that doesn't fit one of these other folders. And of course you can always build out your categorizations as you develop your application. One thing to warn is once you've created and added a component to one of these buckets, it is actually a bit difficult to move them out after they've started being used within the pages by authors. So next up is our page folder, and I've broken these out also. So our first bucket is content, and this is going to be just your standard content pages. Typically these are very flexible and consists of pages with parses that authors can use to create a variety of layouts using the components that you've allowed them to use. Second up is landing page. This might hold things like home pages or topic pages. And these typically have a bit more structure in terms of the layout, and it might have fixed components placed on the page in a certain organization. Site are for pages that need very specific behavior attached to them and may actually need some sort of functional logic to be tied to their implementation. So a potential example of this might be something like a search page. So now we have our basic structure for components. We can move on, and the next logical piece is our templates. And the templates really are just an index or table of contents of the page components listed here. Typically this works pretty well as a flat structure, or you can organize it as you see fit. I'll leave it as a flat structure for this particular screencast. The last big piece for our application folder here is to create a widgets folder. So I've pasted in a widgets folder, and I will walk you through the information inside of here. So let me open this up. The first thing to notice is we have a .content.xml folder, or .content.xml file, I should say. And if we open this up, we're going to see that this is the file that actually defines the node type that this widgets folder will be created as we install it into CQ. So the first thing we want to do is define the primary type. In this case, our widgets will be a CQ client library folder. And we are going to be adding it to the category of CQ-.widgets. And this is a out-of-the-box category that is used within the authoring, CQ's WSAME authoring experience. And this is going to ensure that any of the CSS and JavaScript that we add within our project is exposed to the authors and can be used within the dialogues as they go through and manage their content. So next up here is the source folder, and this is really just a container for the actual source that we'll be using. Within here we have a CSS, and this could contain any of the CSS files that are required. Typically this is a little less used as most of the dialogues are built using XJS's styles and framework. This may become a little bit more prevalent as we move to Coral UI. The JS folder is heavily used, and this usually has definitions for new X types and things like that. Back to the parent widget folder, which is CQ client library folder, we have the css.txt, and this is just going to create or contain a list of the CSS files that are needed to be loaded by our custom client library. A nice trick is using the base directive here. We can actually specify the base directory that this particular txt file will look in. So in this case, for our example here, the base would be source CSS. And then likewise for the JS, we can do the same thing. We can set a base of source/JS. And we can get into a little bit more detail around the client libraries in our next step. So now we have a place with the widgets folder where we can put all of the front-end assets required for our extensions of the authoring experience. So at this point, we've more or less tackled the apps folder. So let me go ahead and close these. And the next big piece that we need to do is define our Etsy client libs, which is going to house the front-end assets that define the brand for our site. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead here and I'm going to create an Etsy folder, and within that a client libs folder. And within this we're actually going to build out our particular projects folder here. And we're really just going to copy the same structure as is under apps. We have AEM cast demo for our project. So I'm going to build AEM cast demo. And when we install, these will just be created as standard folders within CRX. And these, since these already exist in CRX, these won't be touched. So now we have a folder that can contain all of our JS and CSS for our demo project. So the first client library that we will be creating for our demo project is the main client lib. And this contains all of the CSS, JS, and images that are just generally used for the site. Very often these are assets that are delivered by a UI team or a UX team, and really kind of define the overall brand of a site. So I like to use the terminology main for this particular client library. And let me open this up. Again, you'll notice that we have the content.xml. So we actually want this main folder to be created as a CQ client library folder. So let me go ahead and open this again. So you'll see that we do have it set as a client library folder as the primary type. The next thing we'll want to do is set a category for this as we want to reference it. The typical naming convention here is dot-based, so it's usually the project name and then dot the client library name. So in my case, I'm working with aemcast.demo and the client library is main. If I needed to embed or have any dependencies, I could add them here as well. Currently, I do not. So next up is we want to include any of the JS and CSS that's been provided to us for this main client library. So in the source folder, again, we have the very common CSS, images, and JS folder structure. The CSS, of course, can contain any number of CSS files needed to display the site. Images would contain any static assets. Typically, these are referenced by the CSS files. On occasion, they can be used essentially hard-coded into page templates. But note that these images are not managed within the DAM lifecycle and typically shouldn't be edited by authors. And lastly, we have JS here, and this is any of the JS that might be needed generally for the site. So I've added a CSS file and a JS file here, and I'll show you how to include these into the overall client library. Let's do the CSS first. So we need a file called css.txt under our client library, and I'm going to use the base directive. So this is basically saying any of the files listed further in this file should be looked for under this base folder. So in this case, we're looking under source.css, and I can simply now just say styles.css, and it will look and find this particular CSS file. Similarly with the JS, I can do the same thing. I can say base equals source/JS, and in this case I have a hello world.js file. So now whenever this aemcasts demo.main client library is used, these two mentioned assets will be included. So now that we have the main client library, usually the best approach is to create another library and have this be named all. And again, these names are totally subjective, but these are just common practices. So I'm going to create a new all folder. I'm actually going to just go ahead and copy and paste this content.xml from our main client library into all. And I'm going to go ahead and edit this. And again, using the common naming convention, we have aemcast.demo.all. And the trick here is I'm actually going to embed the aemcast.demo.main client library into this. And the reason we do this is because it's very nice to have a single client library that we can expose a variety of CSS and JavaScript through. So another candidate that we typically see, and we'll get into a little bit more detail in future episodes, would be adding something like aemcast demo.components. So this could surface any of the CSS and JS used for any of our other components that we create, and essentially all of that CSS and JS could be packed together into a single client library, essentially a single CSS and JS file, and served through the aemcast.demo.all. So this is a very powerful tool, so we should make sure we use it to our advantage. So now we have our Etsy Client Libs folder set up, and we have our apps folder set up. And this is really kind of the baseline that we need to start developing against our component project. And lastly, what we need to do here is we need to update our filters for our package to include our new Etsy Client Libs folder. So I'm going to go to the meta.int folder, and you'll see here we have a filter.xml that was created by the Maven archetype. Currently, the only folder that is included is our apps aemcast demo folder, and I'm going to want to add our client libs as well. So let me go ahead and save that. And if we go and perform our install. Let me do a Maven clean install, auto install package. And this is going to install it to my local authoring instance. Let me go ahead and check and see here. Let me refresh this. So now we have Etsy, Client Libs, AEM casts, demo, and we have all, and you can see here that we do have the client libraries that we've included. It is a client library folder. We also have main. Now let's go ahead and check our apps folder. Apps, AEM cast, demo. Now we have our components, content. We have our organization here. Same with global. Our templates is flat. And here's our widgets for our application. So at this point, you should be ready to go and start actually building out all the various aspects of your project.